Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the growing conflict between the British and the European colonists. We discussed the 7 Years' War, and again how this kind of sows the seeds. It sets the stage in the sense that Britain becomes the most powerful European empire on the eastern seaboard. They don't have to contend with the French anymore, so they're kind of not particularly interested in in really compromising with anyone, quite frankly. And they're not interested really in what a lot of the colonists have to say. And that's what's gonna probably lead to a great deal of the conflict. So we're looking at the period approximately between 1763 to around 1783. So the empire and their colonial subjects. So the British Empire wanted to tax the colonists. They wanted to raise taxes to pay for what they saw as their protection of the colonists. What they saw as them securing the eastern seaboard for the conflict for the colonists, etc. Right? And they felt they had a right, they had a prerogative as their sovereign to tax their subjects. They also wanted to control expansion into the frontier in order to avoid conflict with the indigenous people and to continue to do trade with them. The British had a very rigid class system. They often felt the Americans were haughty and arrogant, and there was a lot of resentment from the colonists of this kind of class, very rigidly stratified system, right? And also, the British want to use the colonies as a place to pull raw materials out and then manufacture those materials and sell them back to the colonists. But the colonists kind of want to sell their stuff to whoever they want to, and they don't necessarily want to be restricted to only buying, goods made in Britain. So the American colonists, on the other hand, wanted representation in Parliament, so they could actually have some input on legislation around taxes. They were quite miffed about having to participate in wars, particularly the 7 Years' War. A lot of them felt like they were pulled into this conflict between the French and the British, that they weren't sure that they had a place in that. And again, they want free trade. They want to expand trade wherever they wanted to. One of the most important issues that really universally united people in their dislike of the empire was the restriction of expansion into the so-called Indian territories where the Native Americans were. And they wanted a much more aggressive removal of Native Americans and being able to occupy those spaces. But it's the taxes is what really gets, particularly the political elite and the trade, the people who are engaged in trade, the people who are, benefiting most from the economy. These are the things that really kind of these create great conflicts. The Sugar Act basically reduced taxes on molasses, which is used for rum, but strengthened the mechanism to stop colonial merchants from selling molasses to the French, the Spanish, or anyone other than the English, right? It also kept the colonials from issuing currency. And so these were things, again, this comes to this issue of trade. They want to trade to whoever they want, especially something like rum that kind of sells itself. The Stamp Act was a direct tax of the colonists. Instead of just taxing trade, they required a stamp on printed material showing tax had been paid, right? And so this cry of no taxation without representation becomes this rallying cry of Virginians, especially, such as Patrick Henry, who claimed that just like English subjects back home, they should have representation in Parliament if they were to be taxed, thus having an impact on tax laws. There's a period of colonial unity as a result of these acts where the colonies basically get together and boycott British goods. Virginia House of Burgesses in particular passes a resolution, and other colonies follow to boycott British goods until the acts are repealed. And this is the first time the colonies act in unison. This is somewhat significant. In 1766, the Parliament does repeal those acts. The Sons of Liberty were a group considered radical, formed in New York City in 1765, basically organized political rallies and activities, printed pamphlets, enforced boycotts, and were all around just pretty rowdy activists, sometimes street fighters either, and enforcers of things like boycotts. I want to show you, this is a clip from a movie it's a series called John Adams, which is pretty decent for, a historical drama, of a group of these guys basically kind of lynching a tax collector in Boston. Let's hope my clip works. Oh, flip, it doesn't work. Hopefully you'll get this. You can copy paste this and you can watch this on your own. So Charles Townshend, British finance minister, basically in 1767, proposes taxes on imports. Americans all again respond with a renewed boycott. This is the second boycott. Americans use homespun rather than imported English cloth. Again, using American-made materials becomes a symbol of resistance, right? And this is in Boston where you see really this is the heart of this kind of resistance. So again, you see once again people acting as Americans united as colonists, and the colonies are acting in unison. Boston was a hotbed of radical resistance. Troops were stationed there to deal with this. Troops were considered high-handed and often competed with working class people for dock jobs. And that really made a lot of people angry. They were very unpopular. On March 5th of 1770, there's an incident where a bunch of people started gathering, throwing snowballs at troops. In fairness, some of them were putting pieces of iron in the snowballs and throwing and rocks and things like that. At one point, the troops opened fire and killed 5 Bostonians. Future second president of the United States, John Adams, who at the time was a lawyer, ends up defending the troops at trial, and they were acquitted by the jury. It turned out that the officer did not order them to fire. Somebody had said fire. One person fired, everyone followed, and the officer stopped them. Again, Chris, in this particular instance where Crispus Attucks, the first African American man to die in the struggle for liberty, basically for the United States to become a nation, and so he's kind of known for that. But the fact that they were acquitted, and the fact that John Adams, who later on is one of the so-called founding fathers, he defends them, shows you, and even at 1770, there was not this sense that colonists wanted to break from the empire yet. That's not going to happen until 6 years later. So the Tea Act. So the British were trying to help out the East India Company, who was in danger of bankruptcy. And the East India Company were basically the de facto rulers of what is now India. They were wealthy Brits, and they were the ruling class. And a lot of people passing these legislation often had some kind of interest in these companies, particularly the East India Company. So the wealthy Brits and ruling class were heavily invested in this company. They were not about to let it go bankrupt. So this is really about protecting the wealth and revenue of the British upper class. And they basically passed, something called the Tea Act. Again, another intent was to tax tea. Tea, again, was the national drink, just like it is in England now. It was the same in the British colonies. And so they taxed it. So the Sons of Liberty and other people get together and basically dump this tea into the Boston Harbor. Basically, what the East India Company was doing also is they're dumping lower priced tea into the colonies, which undercut local merchants and definitely undercut smugglers in the colonies. So, again, they were taxing this tea, which was of lower quality, and basically pushing it into the market. So these guys dressed as indigenous people dumped about 300 chests of tea into the sea, costing the company about $300 million. So it was a huge financial loss, and this is something that really angered the British ruling class. So in response, the British, of course, are naturally infuriated. They closed the harbor. They passed something called the Intolerable Acts, which basically ended autonomous meetings by colonists in Massachusetts colony. Said the government would henceforth appoint the members of town councils. Soldiers were lodged in people's homes as they were just flooded into the territory, into the colonies to basically establish order. This was correctly read by colonists as encroachment upon their self-governance. These actions mostly united New Englanders in particular in opposition against the British Empire. So in September 1774, a Congress of colonists basically meet in Philadelphia at the same time that a local militia in New England were mobilizing, mostly in a show of force for British representatives. Virginians, Massachusetts men, Pennsylvanians all declared themselves American during this Congress and vowed the united front against what they perceived as tyranny and encroachment upon their rights as, and this is what they said, as English subjects, because that's how they're thinking of themselves. They basically built a committee that began to form shadow governments within the colonies, basically to ignore, subvert, bypass, and sometimes harass colonial governments, which were appointed by the crown, by Britain, by Parliament, and again, like using governors who were appointed by Parliament. Americans basically begin the process of self-government, and they convene a second time in May of 1775. Now, interesting thing, right before they come together, the British basically attempt to confiscate arms from uh, uh, American English colonists in Concord and Lexington in the Massachusetts colony. And this is like you probably heard about Paul Revere's famous ride. This is him warning the militia that the British are coming. The militia mobilizes and fights back, and they actually make the British retreat, although they took pretty heavy casualties. New Englanders were well armed and pretty determined. 49 Americans were killed, but 73 British troops were killed. Then later on, there's a few other things going on. Fort Ticonderoga, which is in upstate New York, were taken by the so-called Green Mountain Boys with Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. These were militiamen from what's now Vermont. At Bunker Hill in Boston, the Brits try to push back, but General Washington is there, and basically the New Englanders had drugged cannons to Boston from like Western Massachusetts, and they forced a British retreat in March of 1776. So what had begun as civil unrest is now a full-blown insurrection by the Americans against their king and the colonial authorities. The Second Continental Congress kind of authorizes the creation of a continental army, right after Lexington and Concord. So it's a war at this point. And so the British mobilize as well. Kind of interesting thing the British do, and they kind of repeat this throughout their colonies and throughout the latter part of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century, is they use this issue of slavery, even though they were really the biggest slave traders of all the Europeans by the mid 18th century. But Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, again appointed by the crown, issued a proclamation on November 7th, 1775, promising freedom to all enslaved Africans and all people in indenture if they became part of the militia. So about 80 to 100,000 enslaved Africans responded to this. Virginia had to organize massive slave patrols to catch and punish them. And when I say Virginia, I'm not talking about the governor. I'm talking about these shadow governments. I'm talking about the militias, the colonials, right? And they were very intent on capturing and bringing these folks back. In 1779, General Philipsburg, a British general, freed all enslaved people in the hands of rebels, regardless of whether they existed or not. So it was similar to what Lincoln will do later with the Emancipation Proclamation, basically just declare anybody who's in rebellion and has enslaved people, those people are free. It's very cynical, but what they're going to figure out is the British are going to figure out it's a very effective way of getting men to fight who are going to really give it their all, because they're literally fighting for their freedom in a very literal way. But, and this is the thing, General George Washington was from Virginia. He was a slave owner. He had a huge plantation. He had hundreds of slaves. He was, like most slave owners, very much against the idea of enslaved Africans fighting. In fact, he banned African American troops from fighting in the Continental Army in November of 1775. The problem was African Americans had already fought at Bunker Hill, Lexington, Concord, Massachusetts. And again, there were, Rhode Island had a significant contingent of enslaved Africans and free Africans who were fighting. African Americans petition for their freedom because they had fought later on. And the dire circumstances of a Continental Army is really going to force Washington to kind of suspend his ban. Again, a lot of African Americans, whether they're enslaved or free, took the rhetoric of the founding fathers to heart. And they made this claim that slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the new republic. So they petitioned for freedom. However, again, we're going to talk about this later. When the U.S. Constitution is written, it kind of indirectly, I would know it really directly. I shouldn't say indirectly. It directly legitimizes slavery, and we'll talk about that later on when we get to the writing of the Constitution. So Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was from Philadelphia. He was a strong proponent of independence. He attacked hereditary rule and held ideas about freedom and self-rule derived from the Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire. He wrote a book called Common Sense. It was a very accessible pamphlet that one could read, and there was a greater percentage of colonists were literate than you had in Europe, in European countries, so people could read this, or it can be read to them. He endorsed free trade in that he felt like Americans should sell to every European empire and stop being involved in European imperial squabbles, such as the French Indian War or the Seven Years' War. He also said America would be an asylum for people who wanted freedom. He wanted to be part of a democratic experiment and get away from what he saw as the imperial European world of wars, of constant wars and conflict, right? And really focus on trade. His pamphlet was very influential. It changed a lot of people's minds regarding independence. It sold close to 150,000 copies. And again, it's very much accessible language. And, it is kind of a great use of a fairly new mode of communication, that being the pamphlet. He's very, very influential. So the Declaration of Independence basically was written by Thomas Jefferson, another Virginian, also a slave owner, had a plantation and hundreds of slaves. And he argues very eloquently that the British had violated its contract with the colonists, really kind of a John Locke kind of idea, giving colonists the right to replace British government with a government of their own. Jefferson wanted to convince Americans that social and political progress was impossible within the British Empire. He advocated self-government, was very big on that, and but all 13 states, all 13 colonies, which at this point now they're states, supported slavery. All of them restricted the rights of free blacks. All of them used property qualifications to determine voting rights, and all of them relegated women to second-class status. So they also deleted, they had a portion of it he wrote that kind of was a condemnation of King George II for forcing the slave trade on unwilling colonists. But the other southern states didn't like that, so they deleted that. But again, the words, we held these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed with their creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, this resonated even with people who it wasn't meant to, particularly free blacks, enslaved people. And later on, millions and millions of other people are going to take this very literally, where at the time, Jefferson had a very narrow kind of definition of who all men, quote unquote, are. So here's again, here's the opening preamble. And yeah, I mean, you have this, this is something, I'm sorry, I usually assign this as a primary source document. Definitely, read it. And again, reading it, unless you understand the context, it seems inconceivable that slavery could exist alongside this. It seems inconceivable that there would be property qualifications to vote. It seems inconceivable, right, that women would have no rights whatsoever. But you have to understand who the men were who were writing this and who they consider to be, again, quote, all men, unquote. Jefferson also accused the king of having, quote, unleashed the merciless Indian savages, unquote, on innocent colonists. And this was about the British using indigenous troops. Again, the Americans is the same thing. So again, it's a lot, some of it's a little bit of like political theater and propaganda, but it worked very well. The Declaration expressed the sentiments of a minority of colonists at the time, but set out hopes for thousands more, right? The struggle for independence from Britain merges with a quest for equality and personal independence, basically. Colonists continued to move westward during the 1760s and 1770s, even though, again, this is something that the British Crown did not allow, right? Um, America's first national government set up after this feared centralized authority. The states wanted to be, quote, they wanted, quote, sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And the United States of America was, quote, a firm league of friendship. And this is all, this language is embodied in the Articles of Confederation written in 1781, not long after the Declaration. Again, the Articles of Confederation reserved to each state all of these things, sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Again, it was kind of a loose confederation that they wanted to set up. They really feared a strong central government, and they're going to write the Constitution in a way to kind of keep that from happening. I think we can see in retrospect now that didn't work very well. But the states were all had their own separate governments. Some of them printed their own currency. They had their own trade agreements with the various nations. They're basically, again, just this firm league of friendship. So again, the Articles of Confederation set up a weak government that almost immediately faced tremendous economic and diplomatic problems, right? A lot of the elites favored a stronger executive power and kind of gained support for a plan to replace the Articles with a new federal constitution. But taxes, diplomacy, currency, these all were a major issue when you have all these different states having different taxes, having different treaties with different countries, having different currencies, etc. The Articles, though, did succeed in formulating the Confederacy did this confederation, right, did concede in formulating the Northwest Ordinance, which was a blueprint for future expansion. And we'll talk about that later. Because as I said, expansion was huge for them. So how goes this war? So this war, again, starts around 1775. It's going to last well into the 1780s. Saratoga is the first like it's one of the first major losses for the British. The British were attempting to invade from Canada. The Continental Army not only defeated them, but also took, thousands of British prisoners. It's a great boost of morale to the colonists. In the southern states, though, most of the colonists were loyalists, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. So it's more like a civil war in those areas. All of the southern states, surprisingly enough, eventually allow enslaved Africans to fight and free blacks to fight, except for South Carolina and Georgia. This is a pretty bloody war. 1 in every 20 American men die in the Revolution. It's an extremely bloody struggle. Yorktown on October 1781 is when the Americans finally defeat the British with the aid of the French, who decided to openly support the Americans. Peace talks begin as the British are no longer, interested, they're no longer to put this much blood and treasure into trying to hold on to these colonies. So Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay negotiate the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1783. The United States gets its independence. It gets all of the eastern seaboard, all the way to the Mississippi River, gets lucrative fishing rights in Canada, in the Indies, and the far northwest, of course, is still within England. That would be Canada. So from the Canadian border to Florida, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, that is the United States of America in 1783 after this war. All right, so that's it for this lecture. And when we come back, we will discuss American independence, and we'll discuss again the Constitution, the basis of the forming of this new republic.